Did you know that, during a time of global crisis, one of the most powerful tools wasn't a weapon, but a garden spade? Britain in 1939 imported over 55 million tons of food a year. That's more than 70% of all the food the country ate. What happens when the ships that carry that food can no longer reach you? Do people just starve, or do they fight back with something unexpected? The government launched a campaign that transformed the entire landscape of the country. Parks, lawns, flower beds, even the moat of the Tower of London were all dug up to grow vegetables. They called it the Dig for Victory campaign. It was a battle fought not on foreign fields, but in backyards and on balconies. And the weapons of this war were posters. Simple, direct pieces of paper that convinced millions of ordinary people they could make a difference. These weren't just ads for vegetables. They were messages of hope, resilience, and community. They were designed to change minds, to change habits, and ultimately to feed a nation. But how did they actually work? What psychological tricks did they use? And what can these nearly 80-year-old images teach us about our own relationship with food, community, and crisis today? Number 20 was a spade mightier than a sword. The poster is simple. It shows a boot, a sturdy working-class boot planted firmly on the head of a spade. The spade is slicing into rich, dark soil. There are no people, no smiling faces, just the act of digging. The words are stark and clear: dig for victory. This was one of the first and most famous posters of the campaign, launched by the Ministry of Agriculture and Fisheries in October 1939. It was a direct command. It wasn't a suggestion. It was an instruction for national survival. Before the conflict, Britain was dangerously dependent on imported food. Over 55 million tons of food and fertilizer arrived by ship each year. This reliance was a critical vulnerability. The government knew that supply lines would be targeted. The U-boat threat was real. If the ships stopped coming, the country would face starvation within months. The plan to counter this was radical. It was to turn the entire nation into a giant farm. Every spare piece of land was to be cultivated. Public parks, sports fields, railway embankments, private gardens, and even bomb craters were repurposed. The campaign's initial challenge was psychological. How do you convince a nation of shopkeepers, factory workers, and office clerks to become farmers overnight? Many people lived in cities and had never grown anything in their lives. Gardening was seen by many as a leisure activity, a hobby for the middle class. This poster changed that perception. The boot is not a gentleman's shoe, it's a worker's boot. The spade is not a flimsy garden tool. It's a heavy-duty instrument. The image militarized the act of gardening. Digging wasn't a hobby anymore. It was a duty. It was a form of national service. The man behind this push was Lord Woolton, who became the Minister of Food in 1940. He was a master of public relations. He understood that you couldn't just order people to do something. You had to inspire them. You had to make them feel part of a collective effort. The Dig for Victory campaign was his brainchild. It wasn't just about producing food. It was about morale. It gave ordinary people something positive and constructive to do. When they felt helpless in the face of global events, they could go into their garden and take direct action. They could see the tangible results of their labor. The response was staggering. In 1939, there were around 750,000 allotments in Britain. By 1943, that number had doubled to over 1.4 million. It's estimated that these home gardens or victory gardens were producing over 1 million tons of vegetables annually. This wasn't just a supplement to the national diet. It was a vital lifeline. It freed up shipping space for essential war materials and ensured that the population had access to fresh, nutritious food, which was critical for health and productivity. The simple image of a boot on a spade was the first step in a revolution. It showed that power didn't just come from factories and armies. It could also come from the soil. But what did the experienced lifelong farmers think of this sudden influx of amateurs digging up their lawns? Was there a hidden resentment towards these new victory gardeners? How many of these new plots failed in the first year due to blight, pests, or simple inexperience, and were these failures covered up to maintain public morale? Did the government have a secret, more pessimistic projection for how much food could actually be grown, hedging its bets against the campaign's public optimism? Number 19, could a woman's place be on the land? Imagine a woman, she's not in a kitchen, she's not in a factory, she's standing in a field holding a pitchfork. Her sleeves are rolled up, and she looks directly at you. Her expression is one of calm competence. The poster's message is simple: for a healthy, happy job, join the Women's Land Army. This wasn't just a recruitment poster, it was a social statement. It challenged long-held ideas about what women could and should do. The Women's Land Army, or WLA, was a civilian organization that placed women in agricultural jobs to replace the male farm workers who had gone to fight. It was first formed during the First World War and was re-established in June 1939, even before the Dig for Victory campaign officially began. The government knew that food production was going to be a problem, and they needed a workforce. The initial recruitment drive was difficult. Farm work was seen as hard, dirty, and unsuitable for women. The pay was low, often less than what a woman could earn in a factory. The posters had to combat these negative perceptions. They portrayed the work as healthy, patriotic, and even glamorous in a rustic way. They showed women driving tractors, tending to animals, and harvesting crops. They created an image of the land girl as a strong, independent, and vital contributor to the national effort. By 1944, there were more than 80,000 women in the WLA. These were not just country girls who were used to farm life. They were shop assistants, hairdressers, typists, and domestic servants from cities all over Britain. They were given a brief training course, a uniform, and then sent out to farms across the country. The transition was often a shock. They worked long hours in all weather conditions for very little pay. They faced skepticism and sometimes hostility from the male farmers who didn't believe they could do the work. But they did the work. They plowed fields, milked cows, dug potatoes, and managed livestock. They proved that they were just as capable as the men they replaced. Their contribution was immense. Without them, Britain's agricultural output would have collapsed. They were a crucial part of the food production chain that the Dig for Victory campaign was designed to support. The campaign encouraged people to grow food in their gardens, but the WLA was responsible for the large-scale farming that fed the nation. Lady Denman was the formidable director of the WLA. She fought tirelessly for better pay and conditions for her girls. She understood that their morale was just as important as their physical labor. The posters were a key part of this. They helped to build a sense of identity and pride among the land girls. They made them feel like they were part of a special elite force. The posters didn't just recruit women, they celebrated them. They turned the humble farm laborer into a national hero. How much data was suppressed about accidents and injuries suffered by inexperienced land girls operating heavy machinery? What was the real rate of women quitting the WLA due to harsh conditions, and how did this compare to the official, publicly released numbers? Were there ever secret discussions within the government about conscripting women for farm labor if the volunteer numbers fell too low? Number 18 were children just small adults with shovels. The poster shows two children, a boy and a girl. They are kneeling in a garden, tending to a row of young plants. They look happy and focused. The slogan reads, "Little gardener's big victory." The message was clear. Children were not just passive bystanders in this national effort. They had a role to play. They could be active participants in the fight for food security. The involvement of children was a deliberate and strategic part of the Dig for Victory campaign. The government understood that children could be powerful agents of change within the family. They could bring the message of the campaign home from school and encourage their parents to start a garden. The schools across the country became hubs for the campaign. School gardens, which had been a feature of the education system for years, were given a new urgency and purpose. Children were taught the basics of horticulture, how to prepare the soil, how to plant seeds, how to weed, and how to harvest. They were given their own small plots to manage. This was not just a theoretical exercise. The food they grew was used in school canteens, supplementing the often meager rations. In some areas, schools organized gleaning parties, where children would go out into the fields after the main harvest to collect any potatoes or other vegetables that had been left behind. The campaign was also integrated into the curriculum. Children learned about nutrition and the importance of vitamins. They were taught how to cook simple meals with the vegetables they had grown. This was a practical education for a time of scarcity. It gave them skills that would last a lifetime. But it was also a form of propaganda. It instilled in them from a young age the values of thrift, self-sufficiency, and national duty. The posters aimed at children were different from the ones aimed at adults. They were more colorful, more playful. They often featured animals or cartoon characters, but the underlying message was the same. Your contribution matters. Every carrot you grow, every potato you dig, is helping the country. This gave children a sense of agency and importance. At a time when their world was full of uncertainty and fear, the garden was a place where they could have some control. It was a place where they could make a tangible difference. This focus on children was incredibly successful. An entire generation grew up with a deep understanding of where their food came from. They knew the satisfaction of eating something they had grown themselves. This experience shaped their attitudes towards food and waste for the rest of their lives. The little gardeners of the 1940s helped to win a big victory, not just in terms of food production, but in terms of building a resilient and resourceful society. What was the psychological toll on children who were given such a heavy responsibility at such a young age? Were there studies conducted on whether this early introduction to national duty created anxiety? How many schools were secretly reprimanded by the Ministry of Food for failing to meet their vegetable growing quotas? Was there a black market for seeds and tools run by enterprising children? Number 17 was food waste the real enemy? This poster is aggressive. It shows a photograph of a kitchen waste bin overflowing with discarded food, potato peelings, bread crusts, wilted vegetables. Pointing an accusatory finger at the bin, and by extension at the viewer, is a shadowy figure. The text is a blunt command: the good housewife does not waste food. This wasn't a friendly suggestion, it was a moral judgment. During the war, waste was not just a personal failing. It was an act of sabotage. Every crust of bread thrown away, every potato that went bad, was seen as a betrayal of the national effort. Lord Woolton, the Minister of Food, understood that increasing food production was only half the battle. The other half was reducing food consumption and eliminating waste. He launched a massive public campaign to persuade people to be more frugal. This campaign ran parallel to Dig for Victory. It was a pincer movement in the war on hunger. One campaign focused on production, the other on conservation. The posters were a key weapon in this fight. They used shame and guilt to change people's behavior. They equated wastefulness with carelessness and a lack of patriotism. They created a social pressure to be seen as thrifty and resourceful. The government also provided practical advice. They published leaflets and broadcast radio programs with tips on how to make food go further. They promoted recipes for dishes like Woolton pie, a vegetable pie that used a variety of homegrown vegetables and was designed to be a nutritious and filling meal that used no meat and very little fat. They encouraged people to use every part of the vegetable. Potato peelings could be fried to make crisps. Cabbage stalks could be grated into salads. Nothing was to be thrown away. The campaign also introduced the concept of communal pig bins. These were large bins placed on street corners where people could deposit their kitchen scraps. The scraps were then collected and used to feed pigs, which in turn provided meat. It was a closed loop system, a national recycling program for food waste. By 1944, these pig clubs were producing enough meat to feed 500,000 people a week. It was a brilliant example of turning waste into a valuable resource. The anti-waste message was relentless. It was in newspapers, on the radio, and on posters in every town and village. It created a culture of thrift that lasted for decades after the war ended. People who lived through this period often developed a lifelong aversion to waste. The poster with the pointing finger was a powerful symbol of this new morality. It turned the humble kitchen bin into a battleground. It reminded every housewife that her daily choices had national consequences. The enemy wasn't just overseas, it was in her own home, in her own bin. What was the actual measured reduction in household food waste during the campaign? Did the Ministry of Food use covert methods like analyzing the contents of municipal rubbish to track its effectiveness? Were there prosecutions of individuals for excessive wastefulness? And if so, were these cases kept out of the papers to avoid public panic or backlash? How did the food processing industry, which often relies on a certain level of waste, secretly lobby against these extreme thrift measures? Number 16, could a radio voice teach a nation to garden? The poster is almost like a page from a textbook. It shows clear, simple diagrams of how to plant seeds in a row. There are measurements and instructions. Sow seeds thinly, it advises. Allow room for growth. This was a different kind of poster. It wasn't just about inspiration, it was about education. It was a practical guide for the millions of new gardeners who had no idea what they were doing. The Dig for Victory campaign was a massive educational undertaking. The Ministry of Agriculture had to teach a nation of amateurs how to become competent food producers, and they had to do it quickly. They used every medium available to them. They published hundreds of pamphlets and leaflets with titles like How to Grow Onions and Pest Control for the Amateur. These were distributed through post offices, libraries, and town halls. They were written in simple, non-technical language that anyone could understand. But perhaps the most powerful educational tool was the radio. The BBC played a crucial role in the campaign. In 1934, a radio program called In Your Garden was launched, hosted by a charismatic and knowledgeable horticulturist named C.H. Middleton. Mr. Middleton, as he was affectionately known, had a calm, reassuring voice and a gift for explaining complex gardening topics in a simple way. When the war started, his weekly Sunday afternoon program became essential listening for millions of Victory gardeners. He became a national figure, a gardening guru for the entire country. People would listen intently, taking notes as he gave advice on what to plant that week, how to deal with cabbage white butterflies, or the best way to store potatoes for the winter. His popularity was immense. At its peak, his program had an audience of over 3.5 million people. The posters often reinforced the messages that Mr. Middleton was delivering on the radio. A poster showing how to build a compost heap would appear shortly after he had dedicated a program to the topic. It was a coordinated multimedia educational campaign. The posters provided the visual reminders of the lessons learned from the radio broadcasts and the pamphlets. So they were a constant source of information and encouragement. This educational aspect was vital to the campaign's success. It wasn't enough to just give people a piece of land and a packet of seeds. You had to give them the knowledge and the confidence to succeed. The government understood that a failed garden was not just a loss of food, it was a blow to morale. By providing clear, practical advice, they empowered people to take control of their own food supply. The instructional posters were the quiet, unsung heroes of the campaign. They didn't have the dramatic flair of the patriotic posters, but they were the ones that actually taught people how to dig for victory. Did the BBC or the ministry ever deliberately broadcast incorrect gardening advice to test how many people were actually listening and following instructions? Was C.H. Middleton's public persona carefully crafted by government propagandists, or was he genuinely the folksy character he appeared to be? Were there rival gardening experts who disagreed with his methods and tried to get their own competing advice to the public? What happened to the vast archives of letters people sent him asking for advice? Number 15 was simplicity, the ultimate form of persuasion. Look at a poster by the artist Abram Games. The design is stark minimalist. It might show a spade transforming into a factory or a ship's funnel. The colors are bold and limited. The message is delivered in an instant. There is no clutter, no unnecessary detail. Wood Games was a master of the maximum meaning, minimum means school of design. His posters were not just illustrations, they were powerful visual arguments. The Ministry of Information, the government department responsible for publicity and propaganda, employed a number of talented artists and designers. They understood that in a time of crisis, messages had to be clear, direct, and memorable. People didn't have time to decipher complex images or read long paragraphs of text. The poster had to communicate its message in the few seconds it took to walk past it on a hoarding. Abram Games was one of the most brilliant of these official war artists. He designed over 100 posters during the war. His style was unique. It was influenced by European modernism and surrealism. He used clever visual puns and metaphors to create striking and thought-provoking images. For the Dig for Victory campaign, he might create a poster showing a carrot dangling from a string, like a medal. The implication was clear growing vegetables was an act of heroism. The design principles used in these posters were incredibly effective. First, they used a limited color palette. Printing in full color was expensive, so artists were often restricted to 2 or 3 colors. This constraint forced them to be more creative and resulted in designs that were graphically strong and visually coherent. Second, they used bold, clear typography. The slogans were short and punchy. They were easy to read from a distance. Third, they used simple symbolic imagery. A spade, a boot, a vegetable, and these were a universal language that everyone can understand. This focus on simplicity and clarity was a hallmark of the best wartime propaganda. The goal was not to be subtle. The goal was to persuade. The posters had to compete for attention with all the other distractions of daily life. They had to grab you by the lapels and deliver their message. The work of artists like Abram Games, F.H.K. Henrion, and Lewitt Him elevated the humble government poster to a form of high art. They demonstrated that good design was not a luxury, it was a powerful tool of communication. They showed that in the right hands, a simple image could be more persuasive than 1,000 words. But were there internal battles within the Ministry of Information between artists with different styles? Did designers like Games, with his modernist aesthetic, face resistance from more traditionalist officials? How much were these artists paid for their work? And was there a secret bonus system for designs that were deemed particularly effective by government surveys? What happened to all the preliminary sketches and rejected designs for these famous posters? Do they sit in a dusty archive revealing a different story of the campaign's visual identity? Number 14, did your garden have to be a fortress? One poster shows a lineup of common garden pests: a slug, a caterpillar, an aphid. They are drawn to look like sinister invaders. Above them, the headline declares "Our garden foes." The poster then gives instructions on how to defeat them using sprays and other methods. This was a common theme. The garden was not a peaceful sanctuary, it was a battlefield. The language of the Dig for Victory campaign was consistently militaristic. You didn't just grow vegetables, you waged war on pests. You didn't just fertilize the soil, you fed the munitions of the soil. This was a deliberate strategy. It framed the act of gardening in terms that people would understand in a time of national conflict. It made the small domestic act of tending a vegetable patch feel like part of the larger heroic struggle. This militarization of language had a powerful psychological effect. It turned every gardener into a soldier on the home front. Their garden was their trench. Their spade was their rifle. The slugs and caterpillars were the enemy. This narrative helped to motivate people and sustain their efforts over the long, difficult years of the war. It gave them a sense of purpose and a feeling that they were fighting back. The campaign identified two main enemies in the garden. The first was the pests. The Ministry of Agriculture published detailed guides on how to identify and destroy common garden pests. They promoted the use of chemical pesticides like Darris dust and Bordeaux mixture. This was a chemical warfare campaign on a miniature scale. The second enemy was plant disease, particularly potato blight. Blight could wipe out an entire crop in a matter of days. It was a devastating and ever-present threat. The posters and pamphlets gave detailed instructions on how to recognize the early signs of blight and how to spray the crop to protect it. This constant battle against the enemies in the garden created a sense of vigilance and discipline. Gardeners had to be constantly on the lookout for signs of trouble. They had to follow a strict regimen of spraying and pest control. There was no room for complacency. A moment's inattention could lead to disaster. This mirrored the wider mood of the country. Everyone had to be vigilant. Everyone had to do their part. The garden was a microcosm of the nation at war. It was a place where the virtues of discipline, perseverance, and relentless struggle were cultivated along with cabbages and carrots. Did the widespread promotion of chemical pesticides lead to any documented environmental damage or health problems that were suppressed at the time? Was there an underground movement of organic gardeners who rejected the government's chemical-heavy advice, and were they seen as unpatriotic? How did the chemical companies that produced these pesticides profit from the campaign, and did they lobby the government to promote their products? What was the true failure rate of crops due to pests and disease, and was it higher than the official figures admitted? Number 13, could you really feed a family from a tiny patch of dirt? The poster is a diagram. It shows a standard-sized allotment, about 10 rods, which is roughly 300 square yards. It is meticulously planned out with rows of different vegetables. There are timings for planting and harvesting. A key at the bottom explains the plan. The title is something like "A Year's Food from Your Garden." The promise was incredible. This small plot of land could provide a family with vegetables for an entire year. This was the core promise of the Dig for Victory campaign. It was an appeal to self-interest as well as patriotism. By cultivating an allotment, you were not just helping the country, you were helping yourself. You were guaranteeing your own family's food supply in a time of rationing and scarcity. The Ministry of Agriculture developed detailed cropping plans to show people how to achieve this. These plans were masterpieces of efficiency. They were designed to maximize the yield from a small space and to provide a continuous supply of fresh vegetables throughout the year. The plans emphasized staple crops that were high in calories and vitamins like potatoes, carrots, onions, and cabbages. These were the workhorses of the Victory Garden. They were relatively easy to grow and stored well. The plans also incorporated techniques like intercropping, planting fast-growing crops like lettuce between slow-growing crops like brassicas in succession, sowing a new batch of seeds as soon as a crop was harvested. This ensured that the ground was productive for as long as possible. The government also provided the resources to make this happen. They subsidized the cost of seeds and fertilizer. Local councils were required to provide land for allotments. Any piece of unoccupied land could be requisitioned for this purpose. This led to a dramatic change in the urban landscape. Manicured lawns in public parks were plowed up. Flower beds were replaced with rows of cabbages. The country became a patchwork of productive vegetable plots. Did it work? Could you really feed a family from a 10-rod plot? The answer is a qualified yes. A well-managed allotment could certainly provide a family with the majority of its vegetables. It couldn't provide everything. It couldn't provide grains for bread or sugar or fats, but it could provide the vital fresh produce that was missing from the ration diet. It made the difference between a monotonous, nutrient-poor diet and a healthy, varied one. The allotment was the cornerstone of the nation's food security. The diagrams on the posters were not just propaganda, they were blueprints for survival. But what was the average actual yield from these allotments compared to the idealized projections in the government's plans? How many people took on an allotment but gave up after a single season because the work was too hard or the results too disappointing? Were the cropping plans designed by experts in the south of England effective in the different climates and soil types of Scotland and the north? Did a black market for prized allotment plots develop in densely populated urban areas? Number 12 was the potato, the perfect propaganda tool. Imagine a poster featuring a character called Potato Pete. He's a cheerful, human-like potato, waving and smiling. The slogan might be, "Potato Pete's recipes help you beat the rations." This was part of a specific sub-campaign. The government realized that while they were encouraging people to grow lots of potatoes, they also needed to encourage people to eat them in new and different ways. The potato was the superstar of the Dig for Victory campaign. It's a nutritional powerhouse. It's high in carbohydrates for energy, and it contains significant amounts of vitamin C, which was crucial when imported citrus fruits were unavailable. It's also relatively easy to grow and produces a high yield in a small area. It was the perfect crop for a nation at war. The Ministry of Food launched a massive campaign to encourage people to eat more potatoes. They had to overcome a certain amount of prejudice. Before the war, potatoes were often seen as a cheap, boring food, something to fill up the plate. The ministry set out to change this image. They portrayed the potato as a versatile and exciting ingredient. They created characters like Potato Pete and published dozens of recipe books with imaginative ways to use potatoes. There were recipes for potato soup, potato scones, potato pastry, and even a mock marzipan made from potatoes and almond essence. Lord Woolton himself was a great champion of the potato. He frequently spoke on the radio about the virtues of this humble vegetable. He famously said that potatoes eaten in their skins were one of the healthiest foods you could eat. The Eat the Skins message was another part of the anti-waste campaign. The skins contain a lot of fiber and nutrients, and throwing them away was seen as wasteful. The campaign was a huge success. Potato consumption soared, people learned to be creative with their cooking, and the potato became a staple of the wartime diet. It was a victory for the propagandists. They had taken a humble, everyday vegetable and turned it into a national symbol of resilience and resourcefulness. The potato wasn't just food, it was a weapon in the war against hunger. Potato Pete might have looked like a friendly cartoon character, but he was a soldier on the front line of the nation's food defense. Were there secret government taste panels to test the appeal of these new potato-based recipes before they were released to the public? How much did the Potato Pete campaign cost? And what was its measured return on investment in terms of increased potato consumption? Did less glamorous vegetables like Swedes or turnips have their own proposed cartoon mascots that were rejected by the ministry? What was the real nutritional impact of this heavily potato-based diet on the long-term health of the population? Number 11. Could a community be built on cabbages? The poster shows a group of people. They are men and women of different ages. They are all working together on a large plot of land, an allotment. They are smiling and talking as they work. The slogan is simple, dig together. This poster was about more than just growing food. It was about building community. The Dig for Victory campaign was a powerful force for social cohesion. The allotment was a great leveler. In the allotment field, a bank manager might be digging alongside a bus driver, and a lady of the manor might be sharing gardening tips with a shop assistant. It broke down social barriers and, brought people together in a common cause. Allotment associations sprang up all over the country. These associations provided a social focus for the community. They organized seed swapping schemes, tool sharing programs, and competitions for the biggest marrow or the longest runner bean. This sense of community was vital for morale. It combated the isolation and anxiety that many people felt. The allotment was a place where people could gather, share news, and support each other. It was an escape from the grim realities of the war. It was a place of peace and productivity. The government actively encouraged this communal aspect. They knew that people were more likely to stick with the hard work of gardening if they felt they were part of a team. The posters often depicted these scenes of communal activity. They showed families working together in their gardens or groups of neighbors tending a communal plot. The message was that this was a collective effort. You were not alone in this struggle. You were part of a vast civilian army of gardeners, all working towards the same goal. This created a powerful sense of solidarity. This community spirit extended beyond the allotment gate. People shared their surplus produce with neighbors who didn't have a garden. The Women's Institute and other voluntary groups organized community canning and preserving centers, where people could bring their fruit and vegetables to be made into jams, pickles, and chutneys. This ensured that nothing was wasted and that the harvest could be enjoyed throughout the winter months. The Dig for Victory campaign didn't just transform the landscape of Britain, it transformed the social fabric. It reminded people that by working together, they could overcome any challenge. But how much conflict and tension was there on these allotments? Were there disputes over land boundaries, water rights, or accusations of tool theft that were never officially recorded? Did the government plant informants in allotment associations to gauge public mood and report any signs of dissent? What was the real social dynamic? Did pre-existing class structures simply replicate themselves within the allotment community, despite the propaganda of social leveling? Number 10, did the posters tell the whole truth? Consider a poster that shows a perfect, blemish-free carrot being pulled from the soil by a smiling, healthy gardener. The sun is shining, the garden is neat and tidy, everything is perfect, but was this the reality for most victory gardeners? Propaganda, by its very nature, is a selective representation of reality. It highlights the positive and downplays the negative. The Dig for Victory posters were no exception. They presented a consistently optimistic and cheerful vision of gardening. They rarely showed the backbreaking labor, the failures, the frustrations, and the sheer hard work that was involved. They didn't show the crops that failed due to blight or the lettuces that were devoured by slugs overnight. They didn't show the gardener with an aching back, struggling to dig heavy clay soil in the pouring rain. This was a deliberate choice. The purpose of the posters was to motivate and inspire, not to present a realistic documentary of the gardening experience. They were selling the idea that anyone could be a successful gardener and make a real contribution to the war effort. To do this, they had to create an idealized version of reality. They had to make it look easy and rewarding. There was a danger in this approach. It could create unrealistic expectations. A new gardener, inspired by the sunny posters, might become discouraged when faced with the harsh realities of their own garden. Their weedy, slug-infested plot might look nothing like the perfect gardens on the posters. However, the campaign mitigated this risk with its strong educational component. The pamphlets and radio programs provided the practical, realistic advice that was missing from the posters. They acknowledged the challenges and gave people the tools to overcome them. The posters were the hook. They were the bright, attractive lure that drew people in. They created the initial enthusiasm. The detailed, practical advice that followed was what sustained the effort. It was a sophisticated, two-pronged approach. The posters created the will, and the educational materials provided the way. So, while the posters may not have told the whole truth, they told a necessary and effective truth. They told a story of hope, success, and empowerment that the nation desperately needed to hear. Were there internal government reports that criticized the Dig for Victory posters for being misleadingly optimistic? Did the Ministry of Information ever test posters with more realistic, warts and all depictions of gardening, and what were the results? How many letters did the government receive from disillusioned gardeners complaining that their experience did not match the one promised in the propaganda? Was there a deliberate policy to destroy negative feedback to maintain a uniformly positive public record of the campaign? Number 9, what happened to the flowers? The poster is almost shocking in its starkness. It shows a beautiful bed of flowers being dug up. A spade is slicing through the colorful blooms. The text reads, "Grow vegetables, not flowers." This was one of the most controversial messages of the Dig for Victory campaign. For many people, their flower garden was a source of great pride and joy. It was a place of beauty and tranquility, an escape from the ugliness of the world. To be told to destroy it felt like a violation. It was a sacrifice that many were reluctant to make. The government had to persuade them that this sacrifice was necessary. They argued that in a time of national crisis, land was too precious to be used for purely ornamental purposes. Every square foot of soil had to be used for food production. This vegetables over flowers message was pushed hard. Public parks, famous for their spectacular floral displays, were among the first to comply. The flower beds in London's Hyde Park were famously converted to allotments. The Royal Horticultural Society, the guardian of the nation's gardening traditions, threw its full weight behind the campaign. They repurposed their research facilities to focus on food crops and published advice on how to grow vegetables. The campaign was largely successful. Millions of flower beds were converted to vegetable patches, but there was resistance. Some people refused to dig up their flowers, arguing that beauty and morale were just as important as food. They saw the destruction of flower gardens as a concession to a bleak utilitarian worldview. There was a quiet cultural battle being fought in the gardens of Britain. The government's position was pragmatic. They needed the land, but they also understood the importance of morale. The complete absence of flowers would have been demoralizing. A compromise was often reached. People were encouraged to plant a few flowers among their vegetables. A row of marigolds could be planted next to the carrots. Sweet peas could be grown up a bean frame. This had the added benefit that many flowers attract pollinating insects, which are beneficial for vegetable crops. The message evolved from no flowers to food first. It was a small concession, but an important one. It acknowledged that even in the darkest of times, people still need a little beauty in their lives. What was the true extent of the resistance to digging up flower gardens? Were individuals ever publicly shamed or even fined for refusing to convert their ornamental gardens? Did the government conduct secret psychological studies on the impact of the loss of public flower displays on civilian morale? Were there any high-profile public figures who spoke out against the vegetables not flowers policy? Number 8, how did they sell a root vegetable pie? The poster is a simple text-based affair. It lists the ingredients and instructions for a recipe. Woolton pie, it announces. The name itself was a stroke of marketing genius. It was named after the Minister of Food, Lord Woolton. This gave the dish an official stamp of approval and a patriotic feel. The invention of Woolton pie was a direct response to the challenges of wartime rationing. Meat was heavily rationed and often unavailable. The Ministry of Food needed to create a dish that was nutritious, filling, and used only non-rationed or readily available ingredients. The pie was developed by the chefs at the Savoy Hotel in London. The filling consisted of diced and cooked root vegetables such as potatoes, carrots, parsnips, and turnips, topped with a potato or wholemeal pastry. The challenge was to make this rather humble dish sound appealing. The posters and recipe leaflets presented it as a delicious and patriotic meal. They emphasized its health benefits. It was full of vitamins and minerals. It was a secret weapon in the fight for fitness and health. The name Woolton Pie was key. Eating it was a way of showing your support for the Minister of Food and his policies. It was a culinary act of patriotism. Did people like it? The reviews were mixed. For many, it was a symbol of the bland, monotonous wartime diet. The combination of root vegetables could be watery and tasteless, if not cooked properly. A common joke was that the secret to a good Woolton pie was to have Lord Woolton cooking it for you. However, for others, it was a warm, filling meal on a cold day. It was adaptable. You could add any vegetables you had from your garden. You could add a dash of gravy browning to make it look more appealing. Whether it was loved or loathed, Woolton pie became an icon of wartime Britain. It represented the spirit of ingenuity and making do that defined the era. It was a testament to the government's ability to influence not just what people grew, but what they ate. The campaign to promote Woolton pie showed that food propaganda was not just about encouraging production, it was also about managing consumption and shaping national tastes. The humble vegetable pie became a symbol of a nation pulling together and making the best of what they had. Were there secret government reports detailing the public's real, often negative, reaction to Woolton pie? Did Lord Woolton himself actually eat the pie? And if so, how often? How many alternative national dishes were developed and rejected by the Ministry of Food before they settled on the pie? Was the recipe deliberately leaked to elite hotels like the Savoy to give it an air of sophistication it might not otherwise have had? Number 7, was there a dark side to the allotment? The poster is cheerful. A family father, mother, and 2 children are all happily working together in their sun-drenched garden. Everyone is smiling. It's an image of domestic harmony and productive leisure. But was this always the reality? For many, the allotment was not a hobby. It was a second job. After a long day of work in a factory or an office, a man or woman would have to come home and then spend several more hours digging, weeding, and watering their allotment. It was exhausting, back-breaking work. Sunday, traditionally a day of rest, became the busiest day of the week for many victory gardeners. The posters rarely, if ever, depicted this reality. They didn't show the mud, the sweat, or the sheer exhaustion. There was also the pressure to succeed. A productive garden was a source of pride and a vital source of food. A failing garden was a source of shame and anxiety. Neighbors would compare their crops. There was a subtle and sometimes not so subtle competition to have the neatest rows and the biggest vegetables. This could create a great deal of stress. For a family struggling to make ends meet, the success of their allotment was not just a matter of pride, it was a matter of survival. The campaign's militaristic language also contributed to this pressure. If you were a soldier on the home front, then failure was not an option. A blighted potato crop or an infestation of cabbage white butterflies could feel like a personal defeat. This psychological burden is absent from the cheerful propaganda posters. Furthermore, the Dig for Victory campaign placed a huge additional burden on women. In many families, the man was away at war. The woman was left to manage the household, care for the children, often do a paid job, and now tend the allotment as well. The posters showing happy, harmonious families working together disguised the fact that for many women, the Victory Garden was just one more exhausting responsibility in an already overwhelming schedule. The reality of the allotment was often far more complex and challenging than the simple, happy images of the posters would have us believe. How many people suffered from physical injuries, such as chronic back problems, as a direct result of their allotment work? Were there any documented cases of allotment rage or serious disputes between neighbors that required police intervention? Did the government's health and fitness narrative around gardening deliberately ignore the physical toll it took on an already overworked and underfed population? What was the divorce or separation rate among couples where the allotment became a source of significant conflict and stress? Number 6, could a slogan change a nation's diet? Dr. Carrot and Potato Pete. One poster features these two characters, a wise-looking carrot with glasses and the aforementioned cheerful potato. They are presented as a dynamic duo, the superheroes of the vegetable world. The slogan might be something like, "Your health's defenders." This was part of a wider effort to educate the public about nutrition. The government knew that a population weakened by a poor diet would be more susceptible to disease and less productive. The Dig for Victory campaign was not just about filling stomachs, it was about providing the right kind of food. The Ministry of Food launched a massive public health campaign to teach people about vitamins and minerals. This was a new and unfamiliar concept for many people. They used simple, memorable slogans and characters to get the message across. Carrots were promoted as being full of vitamin A, which was said to help you see in the dark. This was a clever piece of propaganda designed to encourage people to eat more carrots, but it also had a basis in scientific fact. Vitamin A is essential for good vision. The carrots help you see in the dark myth was so successful that it is still widely believed today. The posters often featured simple nutritional information. They would explain that green vegetables provided iron or that potatoes provided vitamin C. They linked the food grown in the Victory Garden directly to health and fitness. Eating your vegetables was not just a chore, it was a way of making yourself strong. It was a patriotic duty to stay healthy and not be a burden on the already stretched healthcare system. This campaign had a remarkable and lasting impact. In fact, studies have shown that the health of the British population, particularly the poorest sections of society, actually improved during the war. Rationing combined with the increased consumption of fresh vegetables from Victory Gardens meant that people had a diet that was lower in fat and sugar and higher in vitamins and fiber than it had been before the war. The average daily intake of essential nutrients increased. Infant mortality rates declined. People were, on average, healthier than they had been during the peacetime years of the 1930s. It was one of the great paradoxes of the war. The Dig for Victory campaign, born out of necessity, led to a public health revolution. But was the carrots help you see in the dark story originally created for a more clandestine purpose, perhaps to disguise the development of new radar technology from enemy intelligence? What other nutritional myths were deliberately created by the Ministry of Food to encourage consumption of certain vegetables? Did the government suppress data about any negative health impacts of the wartime diet, such as deficiencies in certain fats or proteins? How did the pre-war food industry, which sold more processed and sugary foods, react to this massive government-led shift towards fresh vegetables? Number 5, how do you store 1,000,000 tons of onions? The poster shows a woman in her kitchen. She is carefully placing onions onto a string to be stored. Another part of the image might show potatoes being stored in a Hessian sack in a dark cupboard. The headline is practical: store your vegetables for winter. This was the final crucial step in the Dig for Victory process. Growing the food was only half the battle. Storing it correctly was just as important. A successful harvest could be ruined by rot, frost, or pests if it was not stored properly. The government launched a major campaign to teach people the art of food preservation. This was traditional knowledge that had been lost to many people in the age of modern food distribution. They published detailed instructions on how to store different types of vegetables. Root vegetables like carrots and parsnips could be stored in boxes of sand or dry earth in a frost-free shed or garage. Onions and shallots had to be dried thoroughly and then plated into ropes and hung in a cool, dry place. Potatoes needed to be stored in the dark to prevent them from turning green and poisonous. The posters and pamphlets provided a wealth of information on these techniques. They were a crash course in self-sufficiency. For many urban dwellers, this was a completely new world. And they were learning the rhythms of the agricultural year, the ancient skills of the farmer and the smallholder. This knowledge empowered them. It gave them a sense of security. A well-stocked larder was a buffer against the uncertainties of the future. Beyond simple storage, the campaign also heavily promoted other forms of preservation. The Women's Institute played a key role in this. They set up community preservation centers where people could bring their surplus fruit and vegetables. Here they could learn how to make jam, chutney, and pickles. They could also use bottling and canning equipment that they might not have at home. These centers became hubs of community activity, places where knowledge was shared and friendships were forged. The Dig for Victory campaign was not just about the spring planting and the summer harvest. It was about ensuring that the fruits of that labor could feed the nation through the long, cold months of winter. What was the real percentage of harvested Victory Garden produce that was lost to spoilage due to improper storage? Were there any recorded instances of widespread food poisoning caused by incorrectly preserved foods from these amateur efforts? Did the government have to deal with a black market for essential preserving supplies like sugar and glass jars? How did the established food preservation industry view this massive government-sponsored push for home preservation? Number 4, was a poster ever too shocking? Imagine a poster that was designed but never widely issued. It shows a gaunt, ghostly figure of a woman, a specter of famine, looming over a British home. The message is terrifyingly direct. This is what will happen if you fail. This is the consequence of not digging, of not saving, of not doing your part. While most dig for victory, posters were positive and encouraging, the artists and propagandists at the Ministry of Information also experimented with much darker, fear-based imagery. They understood that fear could be a powerful motivator. The artist Abram Games, for example, designed a poster for another campaign that was famously banned. It showed a child with rickets, a disease caused by malnutrition, and linked it to the need for public health measures. The authorities felt it was too shocking, too likely to cause panic and despair. This raises a question about the Dig for Victory campaign. Was there a deliberate decision to maintain a positive, cheerful tone? The campaign's success relied on building a sense of collective efficacy, the belief that we can do this. Fear-based propaganda could have undermined this. It could have made the challenge seem too daunting, the threat too overwhelming. It could have led to panic buying, hoarding, and a breakdown of social order. The chosen strategy was one of empowerment, not terror. The posters told people what to do, not just what to fear. They offered a positive, constructive action that people could take to combat the threat. Dig for Victory is an active, empowering slogan. It's very different from a slogan like dig or starve. The government's propagandists made a calculated decision to use hope as their primary weapon. However, the threat was always there, implicit in every message. Everyone knew what was at stake. The posters didn't need to show images of starvation. The reality of rationing and the news from overseas were constant reminders of the potential consequences of failure. The cheerful posters were a psychological defense against this ever-present anxiety. They were a form of organized optimism, a deliberate strategy to keep morale high, and to convince the British people that they were masters of their own fate. They were told they had the tools to win, and those tools were in their own hands, in their own gardens. Are there archives of these rejected, too shocking posters, and what do they reveal about the government's private fears versus its public messaging? Were there regional experiments where more fear-based posters were tested on the public to see if they were more effective than the optimistic ones? Did psychologists and early public relations experts debate the merits of hope versus fear in classified memos that shaped the entire campaign's tone? How many artists quit or were fired for proposing designs that were deemed too demoralizing? Number 3, did it actually make a difference? So, after all this effort, the posters, the radio programs, the 1.5 million allotments, the back-breaking labor, did it actually work? Did the Dig for Victory campaign make a real measurable difference to the outcome of the war? The answer is an unequivocal yes. The numbers are staggering. By 1943, it is estimated that home gardens were producing around 1.3 million tons of food annually. This included a huge proportion of the nation's vegetables. Almost every household was, to some extent, self-sufficient in vegetables. This had a number of critical effects. First, it freed up an enormous amount of shipping space. Every ton of potatoes grown in a British garden was a ton that didn't have to be imported. This meant that the ships could be used to carry troops, munitions, and other essential war materials. The Dig for Victory campaign directly contributed to the military effort. Second, it ensured the nutritional health of the nation. As we've seen, the wartime diet, with its emphasis on fresh vegetables and whole grains, was incredibly healthy. This meant a healthier, more productive workforce and a population that was more resilient to disease. Third, and perhaps most importantly, it It was a huge boost to civilian morale. It was a tangible way for ordinary people to contribute to the war effort. It gave them a sense of control and purpose in a world that seemed to be spinning out of control. The psychological impact of the campaign cannot be overstated. It was a unifying, empowering, and deeply patriotic movement. Historians like Daniel Todman, in his book Brighton's War, A New World, 1942 to 1947, argue that the management of the home front, particularly food policy, was a critical factor in the eventual victory. The Dig for Victory campaign was the cornerstone of this policy. It was a masterpiece of social engineering and public persuasion. It mobilized an entire population and transformed the country's relationship with food. The posters were the public face of this revolution. They were the simple, powerful messages that inspired a nation to pick up their spades and fight back. But how much of the 1.3 million tons figure was an official government estimate, and how much was based on hard, verifiable data? Were there independent, secret assessments that arrived at a much lower number? If the campaign had failed, what was the government's plan B for feeding the nation? Was it a more draconian rationing system, or were there secret food stockpiles that the public never knew about? To what extent did the success of Dig for Victory in Britain influence similar home gardening campaigns in other countries, like the United States? Number two, why don't we do this now? Look at one of these posters today. A simple image of a carrot with the words "food is a weapon." It's an image from a different time, a different world. And yet, it feels strangely relevant. We are not facing the same kind of global conflict, but we are facing our own set of crises: climate change, food insecurity, supply chain disruptions, and a growing disconnect between people and the food they eat. The Dig for Victory campaign offers a powerful model for how a society can respond to a crisis. It was a government-led, community-driven movement that fundamentally changed the way a country fed itself. It promoted local seasonal eating, reduced food waste, and built community resilience. These are all ideas that are incredibly relevant to the challenges we face in the 21st century. The campaign showed that ordinary people, given the right encouragement and support, can be powerful agents of change. It demonstrated the power of a clear, positive message to mobilize millions of people. It proved that small individual actions, when multiplied across a whole society, can have a massive impact. Today, there are movements that echo the spirit of Dig for Victory. The rise of urban farming, community gardens, and the Grow Your Own movement are all testament to a renewed desire for a closer connection to our food. But these are often small-scale, grassroots movements. What the Dig for Victory campaign had was the full backing of the state. It was a national priority. Imagine if our governments today put the same amount of energy and resources into promoting local food production and reducing food waste as the wartime government did. Imagine a modern Dig for Victory campaign using social media, television, and public art to inspire a new generation to pick up a spade. The posters from the 1940s are not just historical artifacts. They are a reminder of what is possible. They are a challenge to us. They ask a simple question: if they could do it then, why can't we do it now? What specific, powerful commercial lobby, supermarkets, large-scale agriculture, food importers would actively work to prevent a modern government-backed Dig for Victory campaign from ever gaining traction? Have any modern governments secretly modeled and then rejected a similar campaign, concluding it would be too expensive or politically unpopular? If a new campaign were launched, what would the modern equivalent of the two shocking posters look like? Would they show the environmental impact of industrial farming or the health consequences of a poor diet? Number one, what was the real victory? The last poster is one of triumph. It might show a giant cornucopia overflowing with vegetables held aloft by a smiling family. The war is over. The victory has been won. But what was the real victory of the Dig for Victory campaign? The immediate victory was obvious. The campaign helped to feed a nation and win a war. It was a logistical and agricultural triumph. But the legacy of the campaign is much deeper and more complex. It changed the physical landscape of Britain, but it also changed the mental landscape. It gave a generation of people a new set of skills and a new understanding of food. It fostered a culture of thrift, resourcefulness, and community that lasted for decades. For a brief period, it created a different kind of food system, a decentralized, localized, and more resilient system. For a system where millions of people were active producers, not just passive consumers, this was perhaps the most radical and revolutionary aspect of the campaign. After the war, this system was gradually dismantled. Rationing ended. The ships started bringing imported food again. Supermarkets began to replace local grocers. The allotments fell into disuse. The lawns and the flower beds returned. The nation's memory of its own self-sufficiency began to fade. The Dig for Victory campaign became a piece of history, a collection of quaint and nostalgic posters. But the posters remain, and they remind us of a time when an entire nation was mobilized in a common cause. A time when the humblest of acts, planting a seed, pulling a weed, was an act of national importance. Or a time when people understood in a very direct and personal way that food is precious. The ultimate victory of the campaign was not the million tons of vegetables. It was the demonstration that a society, when faced with a crisis, can fundamentally change its relationship with the land and with each other. It was a lesson in resilience, a lesson in community, and a lesson in the power of a simple, hopeful idea. The posters are not just about digging. They are about the victory of the human spirit. What was the long-term economic impact on Britain's professional farmers and market gardeners who suddenly had to compete with millions of amateurs producing their own food for free? How quickly did the skills and knowledge gained during the campaign disappear from the general population after the war ended? Was there a secret post-war government plan to maintain a standby network of allotments and gardeners in case of a future crisis, and was it ever activated during later periods of tension? And finally, if the campaign was so successful, why has its core lesson that a nation is stronger when it can feed itself been so completely forgotten?